Well, Jim, I want to talk a little bit about coping with depression. And since you are a practicing psychotherapist and have helped a great many people that I happen to know, I thought it would be good if we talked along that line. I bring to it sort of a theological understanding and a general reading maybe in the area of psychology. And
I like the way you say coping with depression. That assumes that depression is something that happens to us. It's something that each one of us deals with. It's not something that only is like befall selected people.
Mm-hmm.
It's an issue and an experience that every single one of us copes with, and it's not something that we did once, got over, and never have to deal with again. Coping with means that we have been depressed. Sometimes we are depressed now, and we can count on being depressed in the future.
Depressed in the future, yes, right. You know, I often think, I'm jumping ahead here, but in dealing with college students, very often I think they don't know that. And they're in a depression, and they don't realize there's sort of a cycle to those generally. Although we got to factor in clinical depression, don't we? I mean, some people are rather constantly depressed and very often are helped by medication and so on. I know you're not always that big on medication.
Not always that big? When have I ever been big?
That's true. I know your feelings about that. But as a matter of fact, I know people who have been depressed and have taken antidepressants and somehow are less depressed, and clinical depression. But what you just described, I would call episodic depression, and it's certainly something that we all know, experience one time or another in our lives, even if we don't name it that way. And some people don't. I mean, you ask some people, have you ever been depressed, they'll say no.
Right.
But if you describe the symptoms, they probably are going to say, oh, yes.
Yeah, I've had that, but I wasn't depressed.
Yeah, I've had that.
I've had bad days, but I wasn't depressed. I felt down, didn't know what was wrong, didn't have enough energy, but I wasn't depressed.
Yeah, exactly. And what I started to say was about the college students, that very often I think they need to be reminded of episodic depression. They get in a depression and they think it will never end, and therefore I think that accounts sometimes for the suicides among our young people. They don't have enough experience in the life to know that cycle, that you can be down and not have energy and the world looks dark and black, but that you sometimes lift out of it and the world looks brighter again, and there's a cycle to this. So I find myself repeating that thing that you just said very often to the young people.
Yeah, in a sense, but sometimes people tell me they're depressed, and I say, so what? I mean, it really is. It's part of the journry.
Do they come into your office, Jim, to get help, and you're selling?
Yeah, I say, well, so what? See, and finally, it really is a so what. I mean, it's like, I'm depressed, so what? What's that got to do with anything? I'm depressed, therefore I can't do what I want to do. More often it's a case of I'm depressed and therefore I don't have the energy to do what I want to do and I can't do it anyways. And not only that, it doesn't do any good. See, then it's not the depression that's the problem, it's what I'm doing with the depression. See, that's why I responded so positively to your coping with depression. Because if my style of coping is to give up, then I'm giving myself to the depression and like becoming a slave to it.
Yes.
Rather than recognizing that depression is part of this thing that I'm into, this living process that I'm engaged in, and that I am sometimes I need to take a little time off and pay attention to it.
And see what it's all about. When you were talking there, I was flashing on Martin Seligman, who's written very tellingly on depression, it seems to me, and he calls it a learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness.
I mean, his idea is that somewhere along in life that you end up thinking there's no effects to your actions, that you can't make a difference, and you become a victim. And as a victim, therefore, you're sort of constantly plagued with this depression. I know in later articles he's expanded that notion to some degree to talk about the cultural factors that come into it. He thinks that a lot of it has to do with expectations, that we live in a culture where many people can get whatever they want. I mean, if they want ice cream, they can got enough money to go and buy it, and they can get whatever they want, but somewhere along the line you find out you can't get things like love, or the deeper sense of what freedom's all about, etc. You just can't make those things happen like satisfaction. And when you realize that, then you fall into this helplessness. Then you're saying, oh, geez, life isn't like I thought it was.
Right.
You can't get what you want, and therefore the depression can take over.
Well, it's sort of like one of those basic, I guess, positions on which we view life. For me, it seems that the important things are things that I'm not in control of. that's a like perspective that I have on living. That I'm not in control, finally, of whether or not I die today.
Right.
I'm half in control. I suppose I could kill myself.
Yes.
But I'm not in control of whether a truck hits me from behind or if I come down with cancer this afternoon or such things. I'm not in charge of that.
Right.
I'm not in charge of whether or not you like me. I mean, I can do all kinds of things. I can try to make you like me, which more than likely will have the effect of making you want to withdraw and get away from me.
Exactly, yeah. It's like there's many of the great things in life, when directly sought, they dissolve. It's like happiness. Like you're walking around and say, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to make myself happy. I mean, you can't do that. Happiness comes as byproduct of something else. And I think that factors into this whole discussion, doesn't it, of this depression and how... I mean, I think we do have a cultural problem here. It's intensified, it seems to me, in through the breakdown of institutions as well. That is, that really life doesn't have the settled character that it once had. One might have been able to look to the church for answers, or to have great trust in the government, or the neighborhood was there as support, the family was stable. A lot of things like that did help people to cope with depression on a day-to-day basis have been broken down, and therefore I think it becomes harder to cope with these dark moments that take us over, and when our spirit is flagging, and when we have lost energy and so on.
Yeah, I think of heavy moments rather than dark moments, because I get heavy with all of the things I have to do, with all of the resistance to doing the things that I need to do, with all of the choices that I need to make. I feel heavy. It's like there's a sense of, geez, I didn't know it was going to be this hard.
Right. The existentialist philosopher John Paul Sartre said that we are condemned to be free, that freedom is a burden. And especially in the modern world, that becomes clearer when we have so many options.
Yes.
There's some people who have it tough in life because they have no options. I mean, if you're living in Africa and don't have enough food to eat, or if you're living in certain situations in the United States and the enclaves, or you are in a socio-economically depressed area, you might not have many options. It might be hard to know how to get out of that enclave, or how would you make progress, how would you get a job, how would you go make it in school. There's not many options, but there's a whole other segment of our population that seems to suffer from depression precisely because there are so many options. It's like walking down a supermarket aisle. You can choose many things. You can choose a different religion if you want. You can go live with somebody rather than get married to them. You can become an atheist if you like. You can just do so many different things that some people feel bewildered by it. And when you start talking about burdened with freedom, it often means that one feels a heaviness because the options are so many and it's hard to pick one.
That is the heaviness I spoke of.
Yeah, right. I was talking to one fellow who said, just his plea is, he says, I envy people who can make decisions, I envy people who know where they're going in life, who have a goal, because it all is so bewildering to me. And so he was suffering from a depression based on multiple options. It's almost paradoxical, isn't it?
Well, I think that it's very frequent, paradoxical as it is. I would guess probably in most felt depressions there is some sense of being overwhelmed with the freedom, overwhelmed with the choices, of wanting, instead of choosing, to give up, to say, okay, let life take over, let life live me, rather than me live life. To do that, leaves me with all of my wants, feelings, desires, dreams, wishes, and fantasies, all within, with nothing to act on. Then I have no energy.
Yes. I want to continue to pursue this line, Jim, but I just want to digress for a moment, because I think that commonly the therapists tell us that there are a number of causes of depression. We're talking about depression that comes from a sense of freedom and responsibility and the burden of choice and so on. But I mean, I often find that depression is linked with repression, that it's linked with repressed anger, for example. And my own dealing with people, I mean, has just corroborated that over and over. There will be people who are down and feeling depressed, and what really amounts to is they are feeling tremendously angry at someone, or they're in a rage against God or whoever is running the world, and because they can't face that rage, and anger. They put all their energy into that, and to use a mechanistic metaphor, it's almost as though that effort to block those negative feelings called anger, one blocks all the rest of it. I think the poet Rilke said, if you lose your demons, you'll lose your angels as well.
Absolutely.
And as a matter of fact, while it sounds mechanistic, it does seem as though it's the way people function very often. Now, how about this question of depression and repressed anger? I don't want to make it the focus, but I think we should clarify that at least.
Well, I do operate on sort of a formula that where there is depression. Depress means to push down, and someone needs to express, and to express is to push out. When you express what you have been depressing, the depression is no longer there. And that's a simple kind of formula that I think is very, very frequently valid.
I've seen it happen just even physically, like people, when they are repressing a given emotion, will have a headache. And just sitting there, if you can get them to express the emotion, the headache will go away. I mean, it's
magic.
phenomenal.
Like magic.
Like magic, the headache is gone because there's a whole physical thing that seems to go into this repressive thing. I've had other people who, in trying to deal with repressed anger, find themselves having tremendous energy. I remember dealing with one young woman in a different setting that she could go play racquetball for 3-4 hours at a time, and without getting tired, if she pretended the ball was her parents, who she was very angry at, and she was swatting this around. And she could, the unleashing of energy was just unbelievable.
Yeah, you might appreciate. I recently told a fellow who was really struggling with his father, and who was a very good golfer, but every time he played golf with his father, his game would just explode. So I said to pretend that the ball was his father every time he looked down at it, to put his father's head on the tee. And
Did it work?
He shot a 73.
I might have to find somebody I'm angry with, Jim, to try this out on, to see. Although there are some people whose swings dictate that they would never shoot 73, no matter how angry they were. We know this. But let's go back. Unless there are other causes of depression you want to get into the mix here, besides repression.
I think repressed guilt has the same effect as repressed anger. If I have, let me offer you a perfect example I just heard yesterday of a fellow who's had a special relationship with his father, and one of the things he was doing with that relationship was being a very successful athlete. And he was in a football locker room after a big game, and through all kinds of complications, one of the other guys, a big lineman, tried to pick a fight with him, and he said, I just gave up. I gave my fight to the other team. And the guy hit him in the face, which stunned him, and the guy hit him in the face again. And he froze and walked out. And on the way home, in the car with his father, he told his father what had happened. And his father got very angry at him and accused him of being a chicken, and wanted to know what in the world, why didn't he fight back? And the effect on that is he quit playing football. It's like, not only was and I can my way of handling it, I congratulated him right off. Congratulated him for not fighting, for not hitting back, for not being childish. Because as soon as he told me the story, it was like such a powerful emotional event that not only had he not fought back, even though he may have had cause to, and certainly was angry at somebody hitting him in the face, he then had disappointed his father. And with both the guilt and the anger all stuffed in, with nothing to do with either, he couldn't even play football anymore. It's like he had no way to do, no direction to express any of it.
Could we say that, extend it and say that any repressed emotions would have a chance of somehow causing a depression? We've mentioned guilt and anger.
When you push down feelings that need to be pushed out, then you're going to have to feel depressed.
And the way around that, of course, is to give some expression. Not a total way around it. I think it's one element in therapy, right, to discharge the affect, as they say, to get the emotion out, to express it.
But you see, that's the function of therapy, is not just to understand, it's to change.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's a next step to it. I mean, even
responding to my own feelings.
You get me to emote about my repressed anger, that's nice, but I've got to have a further step. I mean, I got to figure out how to deal with these people who are making me angry. I got to get a more constructive way. I've got to understand why they make me angry. there's a next step to it, is
Right.
what I'm pointing out.
Right.
Always in therapy. I think there's a misguided notion that just by finding the emotion and expressing it, that everything will be fine.
Understanding doesn't necessarily lead to change.
Right. There's a next step in the whole thing, which has to do with decision and so on. And that takes us back, Jim, to the freedom side of this thing, and how we're looking at dealing with this depression. I think that part of it is the accepting of the responsibility. Don't you find that in dealing with people that either in friendship or any setting, or also in your professional work, that oftentimes people will sort of want to be the victim. They want you to solve the problem for them. They don't want to assume responsibility. And it seems like a first step in this is always to say you are responsible, or one way or another, to get people to see that they're responsible. I think it was Fritz Perls who started the Gestalt therapy, who split with Freud on this question. I mean, Freud was very deterministic. He felt that our current actions were all linked with our instinctual life and previous happenings and so on, and it ended up being rather determined. But Fritz Perls suggested that no, that we have freedom and we have responsibility, and you've got to get the client to accept this responsibility for their lives.
We participate even in the things that we most abhor. Yeah. I have some issue, and I think very frequently it's true, that what's popular today about children of alcoholics, that there's an awful lot of parent bashing. That I am what I am because of my parents, and I do what I do because of my parents, which leads to a lot of understanding, but not necessarily to change. And I think very frequently such people are depressed, that they spend all of their time understanding, trying to understand, and connecting and associating and analyzing and criticizing, when what needs happening is some change in behavior.
Some change, right. I think it was Viktor Frankl, another therapist, who said that same thing. I mean, too much introspection, looking within, would end up paralyzing you in one way or another, and that somehow one had to find a meaning and a new direction, as Frankl said. And so you're back to the question of decision. I think that one of the arts of helping people, is it not, to help people take responsibility. In other words, to start out by saying, hey, you're not a victim. I mean, you're not just somebody sitting here who's programmed by your parents. I mean, so your parents treated you badly, so what, in a sense? I mean, you got to get on with your life. I mean, it sounds a little harsh saying it like that, but very often I find myself at least moving in that direction, because otherwise, I mean, if you sort of take a Freudian stance and you're always going to go back to the past and everything's wrong in the past, you can blame it on your friends, your family, bad breaks you've had, but the question is, how do you get on with it? And to get on with it, you have to assume responsibility and to say, okay, I can move forward with this thing.
Yeah, for me the issue then is becoming more aware of what choices are being made and how those choices are being acted on. For example, when someone says to me, can I ask you a question? A simple thing that happens to us very frequently. If I say yes, I have participated with that person in making me responsible for their asking the question.
Yeah.
It's much clearer when I can say, well, notice that you just asked me a question. Rather than ask me if you can ask a question, notice what you're already doing.
Yes.
That also is very gestalty, that of inviting people to pay attention to what they're already doing.
Yeah, the Gestalt therapy is based a lot on what's happening now when you're talking with somebody, right?
Absolutely.
And again, this has broader reference than just to clinical practice. It has a lot to do with how we interact with friends or family or anybody else, right? I mean,
constantly.
Often people will want us to take responsibility for their lives. And,
let me share another example of a woman who comes to me, and she's very weepy and got some serious problems. She's stuck on a dissertation. She had a baby, and now she feels like she can't have a baby and be a mother and a doctor too. She can't do both of those things, and in her life, experientially, that's been true. Anyway, so I have her husband come in with her, and for me, it's like a dramatically different person. That I finally got so frustrated that I sort of jumped on her. She would ask her husband if she could talk to me. He would say something, and she would say, well, could I respond to that to him? And each time he would acknowledge. I finally got frustrated with her and jumped on her. I said, what are you doing to him? You know, how dare you treat him like that, to make him responsible for everything that you say.
I see, you turned it around in a sense. How dare you do that to this other person by making them responsible?
Which is what that's doing.
Yeah.
Okay? The effect incidentally resulted in dramatic changes. I mean, first she was confused. She didn't know what I was talking about. So the next 2 or 3 times she did it, I would point out to her, she just did it again.
Mm-hmm.
And then she would ask me what I meant, and I'd say, now you're doing it to me.
Mm-hmm.
To which she could begin to see that what she was doing was making everybody, her spouse, her father, a next-door neighbor, all responsible for her, for what choices she was making, for what she was doing. And the simple awareness that she was behaving in that way at first was embarrassing to her. Then she started getting angry. And she wrote a delightful letter to her committee, who had been doing the same thing to her, trying to tell her, criticizing a spelling of a word when it was correctly spelled, that she would then say, well, they're the committee, they got the right. And all within that somehow that she had like given over authority for her own life, her own choices, her own decisions, and to almost anybody.
So it goes back to what we were saying about Seligman, saying that depression is connected with a learned helplessness, a pattern that takes over when you think that you're always a victim and that there's nothing you can do about it. And certainly one of the key steps to making progress in life, as you pointed out at the very beginning, we all deal with depression. So we have to learn that we have a responsibility for that we are the ones who have to do something about altering circumstances or finding a different attitude. I suppose finding a new attitude is really crucial to all of this. I mean, a lot of us feel programmed, and there's a lot of givens in our life that are hard to deal with. I find it interesting.
Is there really? Look at that. Let's look at that.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it's given that we're going to die.
It's given that you're born in this century, that you live in this time.
Even this century is a creation of our thinking. I mean, I really don't know how many givens there are. Most of what I call givens
you grew
are
up in
things
a given family.
That I'm participating
You had
in.
parents.
I did.
And you have a genetic structure from them.
It would seem.
No.
And see, I don't even know what influence I have over that.
Well, I don't know what...
I participate in things. I participate in my relationships.
But you participated in a certain way in your relationships in the past. You married a particular woman, you related in a particular way to your children, and as you sit here right now, you are a product of all of that. That's sort of a given. We can't go back and redo those things.
Yes,
Here's where I would
look
at it.
It's never too late to have a better childhood.
Okay, you're going to redo them mentally or...
Yes, emotionally, experientially.
Well, let me tell you where I'm at with that. I mean, I see what you're saying. I would suggest that maybe it's the same thing, that we always have can take up an attitudes towards what I'm calling these givens in our lives. That's the key. In other words, you can have made big mistakes in raising your children, for example, and then the rest of your life you can feel guilty about it and get depressed over it and get nowhere. Or you can take up a different attitude that says, well, I made mistakes and I did some things good, some bad, but I'm not going to let that ruin the rest of my life. I'll go out and talk to my kids and say, can't we do something about it? Or I'm going to make sure I don't make that same mistake with my friends in the future. That's what I mean about you can always take up an attitude towards the givens. I think we might be saying the same thing.
I think we are. You know, when you say that you can take up an attitude, I'm left with a choice, okay? I've offended somebody and now they're mad at me. That's still a choice, and I'm still participating in the fact that I have this relationship in which there is something that's not working. I have the choice to respond to that. I can say, well, it's all their fault, and it's helpless, and whatever's going to go wrong.
Right. Then you're going to be depressed.
Right. Or I can go to that person and say, we have a problem. I think I may have hurt you, I may have offended you, and I don't want this relationship to end. I want to nourish the relationship. Yes. What can we do together?
Right.
I have that choice
now
at any moment of time.
Right.
At any moment of time, I have that choice.
I'm thinking of something that Rollo May wrote in his book Love and Willing. Rollo May being what I'd call an existentialist type therapist, I guess, and very influenced by the theological world, incidentally. But he said the important thing in making progress was to be able to have a wish or a dream of where you wanted to get to, of how things could be better. That he saw that as a first step before deciding, in a sense. So that as someone with no goals, you can't help it. I'm thinking of a married situation. If the two couples having trouble and they're sitting there saying, life is a terrible mess, and if they think it's always going to be that way, well, they're not going to do anything, just probably going to get out of it. But if they can begin to fantasize or wish or dream that it could be better and feel how it could be better, see it, then they can make some decisions on how to get there. And it seems to me a lot of the depression comes from thinking we're trapped, that there's no alternatives, and losing the ability to will or to dream or to wish, as Rollo May talks about it.
Yeah, you use favorite language of mine when you say that the depression comes from thinking. And I'm sure that most all depression does come from thinking rather than from living. And when we begin to think about living, then we can think ourselves into our own helplessness, that there's really nothing I can do about it. Something has gone wrong with the relationship, and I just have to suffer within it. My marriage may be disintegrating right in front of me, but I can't do anything about that because she is the way she is, whatever. Those are all attitudes of helplessness, all attitudes of I can't do anything.
Right.
And I think the depression then is coming from what I'm thinking about what is happening,
and so
not from what is happening.
Right, and to get over it, therefore, our imagination has to come into play. We have to be able to see some alternatives. We have to be able to envision a better future. We have to be able to somehow sense that we're not imprisoned in all this. I think it gets back to saying, well, I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim of the fates in this case. I'm not a victim of past decisions. There really is an openness about where we could go.
Or even if I have been a victim, that's irrelevant
yeah.
to what I have to do now.
Right. You might well have been a victim of abuse or many other things, but are you going to stay a victim?
Right.
That's the real question, isn't it?
Right.
Well, Jim, we've been talking here about coping with depression, and I guess our suggestion is that a lot of depression comes around the question of freedom and will and choice, and that there's a certain learned helplessness that some people get into, and that there's a cycle to depressions, many causes, as we've said. And to get out of it, it appears important to take hold, to take responsibility for our lives, to sense that we're no longer victims, that there are choices to be made, to make decisions to change, not just to understand, but to really move in more constructive directions. And in the midst of all that, I like always to see that faith perspective, that there's a God who's with us in the whole process.